Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Um, I'm quite honored and excited to be giving this talk. I really wish I could have been there to see everyone face to face, but I guess there is always next time. So I really want to start by expressing my gratitude to the organizers of this very important meeting on neuropharmacology research and drug development, especially Martha and Robert. Thank you so much for having me, as well as other colleagues who are there. And a special thanks to all the participants who are in quotes students of this particular meeting. So after the meeting, I thought I would start by introducing myself. So in essence, that's me. Although I think when you see me now, um, the gray hairs may have increased a bit. But yeah, that's me. And when I'm Dexter most of the time, um, on a lighter note, two things come across or come into the minds of people. The first one is this strange looking cartoon character, and the second one is another Dexter with a more darker personality and character. So if you have to associate me with any Dexter, I would rather you associate me with this one, the young genius scientist, and not the serial killer Dexter. The ones who are a bit more mature, the older ones, you might also recall this Dexter, who was Michael Neda, who played Dexter in the TV soap Dynasty in the late 70s and early 80s. So, well, if you want to associate me with this one, it's fine because he's quite a handsome looking chap. Just moving on, a bit about myself. So, I'm an associate professor in the School of Pharmacy, University of Zimbabwe. I hold a Bachelor of Pharmacy honors degree from the University of Zimbabwe, as well as a PhD from the same university in the field of toxicology. And I have a master's degree in toxicology as well. So basically, I teach courses to Bachelor of Pharmacy honors students, as well as Master of Science in Clinical Pharmacology, Master of Public Health, and Master of Applied Pharmaceutical Science students, all within the domain of largely toxicology. But I also teach drug information, as well as other related courses, including sometimes in spending classes teaching spectroscopy and chemistry related subjects. So my research interests are in experimental pharmacology and toxicology, especially as it relates to natural products which are found in Zimbabwe or in the Southern African region. But I also have a deep interest in venomous animals, like your snakes, scorpions, as well as poisonous plants, as well as natural products pharmacology. Like I noted a number of you in this meeting doing work with extracts, which is an area of interest of mine as well. So I'm a pharmacist toxicologist who sometimes pretends to be an experimental pharmacologist, a drug and poisons information. So from a professional view, it is the pertinent ones. I am registered with the Pharmacist Council of Zimbabwe, and then I am also in 3 expert committees of our national regulatory authority, which is the Medicines Control Authority of Zimbabwe. I listened with interest an earlier lesson that you had this afternoon on regulation and how important it is, to have drugs on the market which are safe, efficacious, and of good quality. So I sit in 3 expert committees: Clinical Trials and Pharmacovigilance Committee, the Complementary Medicines Committee, which looks at medicines of largely herbal medicines. But of course, complementary, there are others of natural or mineral origin, as well as the Registrations and Evaluations Committee. And I'm also a European registered toxicologist. So basically, I tend to sit somewhere in the middle of poisonous stuff and pharmacological stuff. My past research has largely been in clinical toxicology, where I think I started off my research career as a scientist, largely at issues to do with poisoning in the country, the management, and describing various syndromes associated with poisoning in Zimbabwe. But over the past few years, I've gravitated towards natural products, looking at the toxicological effects, with a particular interest in neurobehavioral toxicology, but also general toxicology, but also looking at pharmacological effects. And there's one plant which I've been working with for a number of years now, which is Bufondistica, that we are currently in the process of trying to get market authorization with our regulatory authority. So that's what I've been doing. And then sometimes I collaborate with people who do things on nanoparticles and pharmaceutics. And we've got some work that we've done on pralidoxin, which is an antidote for organophosphate poisoning, looking at nanoparticles. Yeah, so put simply, that's me. If it's poisonous, excited about it. That's my family. So I wanted to talk about survival skills for research in Africa, and really the approach which I shall be taking. It shall come largely out of my own experiences, and I do agree that people's experiences do differ and would probably be location specific. But I'm hoping that the issues which I will talk about today are issues which are cross-cutting across the African continent, but perhaps even across anyone who's doing any manner of research. So, where do I start? So, some years ago, in 2011, that's about 10 years ago, a decade ago, I was asked to give a talk to young scientists. I was much younger then, 10 years younger, concerning how to survive research in Zimbabwe. And I just took this slide as I gave it 10 years ago. And I just want to start talking maybe from here before moving on. So we must note that it is a privilege actually to be a scientist in a developing country. And I put so-called developing country because we will get to a point where we are no longer developing, in my opinion. And the reason why is because in Africa, we've got lots of problems. And the moment that you've got lots of problems, that's a good thing for scientists, because then it means lots of problems, mean lots of research questions, and then that means there's lots of work that needs to be done. And the other interesting thing about the region that we survive in is that the environment creates a certain mental and psychological fortitude, in scientists who are brought up in this environment, which is probably specific in such a location, because you have to do research and publish it despite a lack of resources, and sometimes despite all the lack of support, as well as other constraints, which I shall talk about. So having said that, I just want to quickly describe what the terrain of Africa is like. So the terrain of Africa, largely, it is painted with lack of resources, as many of you would know. Or perhaps should we call it lack of prioritization of resources, lack of facilities. And sometimes the leadership is a bit on the totalitarian side. And here I'm not talking about from a political perspective like the government. Yes, perhaps sometimes as high as the government, but even within departments and universities, you always have this elder mentality where you have these gatekeepers, old people who have been in the system, and are obstacles that you actually have to overcome. And the other thing about the terrain that we operate from is that whether we like it or not, we get negative view, and there's a negative image largely from the outsiders. And some of the issues that I will talk about today are issues perhaps which would assist us to overcome some of these negative views and images that we get. And there's immense emotional and psychological pressure working in Africa, not to mention financial pressure, where you're trying to follow your passions, but your stomach is telling you to follow the money. So basically, as we start in Africa, we really start research, on off the back foot. But this does in no way means that it is impossible to do research. It is possible to do research in Africa. It is possible to produce excellent results in Africa. And I just want to share some of those important to put in our minds. So I've put what I believe are some character traits which may be able to assist us as scientists, that you have to develop in order to be able to advance in any meaningful research within the African context. And indeed, I believe they apply even elsewhere in the world. And these really have nothing to do, not really nothing, but not have much to do with lack of the availability of resources, but have more to do with the individual or self. And I believe that these apply to any scientists, but are perhaps more pertinent, like I said earlier, to us who are in this environment of Africa, which is a very rough terrain, so to speak. So the following slides, I highlight some of these which have actually assisted me, or which did assist me to grow up as a young scientist in this environment of Zimbabwe, which is even got its own interesting dynamics, which I hope I'll have a chance to talk about as we go through this. So I've got 8 things or 8 character traits, or 8 things or 8 mindsets that I believe any researcher who should make it or who will make it in Africa ought to develop and cultivate in their minds and in the way that they do their things. On the list, and this is a cross-cutting one. You see, because we are already starting research on a back foot, so to speak, off the back foot, it means that we have to apply ourselves even more than other people. So diligence then becomes critical or key. The word diligence, according to the concise Oxford Dictionary, is careful and persistent application or effort, or industriousness, careful and persistent application or effort. The word careful, you know, just because we are in an environment which many people see as a very difficult one, does not mean that as Africans we should be known as people who are just reckless or careless. Lack of resources is not at all an excuse for recklessness and carelessness. And this comes even in the way that we conduct our work. The moment that you've got very good data going out there into the world, by virtue of that work having been done in Africa, the scrutiny is even more for you, meaning that we ought to be even more diligent, we ought to be even more careful, we ought to even apply ourselves even more. We need to be persistent. Despite the harsh environment of a developing country, if we are to make it in this field of science, then persistence becomes something that we cannot run away from. Persistence means we fall, we get up, we keep pushing. It's hot, we get up, we keep pushing. It's cold, we get up, we keep pushing, and we keep pushing, and we keep pushing until we see the things that we want coming into fruition. The other thing, other word which is there is effort. And effort talks about sweat, it talks about work, it talks of application, it talks of pushing, and it talks of pulling. So careful and persistent application or effort is, in my opinion, one of the most important things that we have to develop, a mindset that we have to develop. And this has got nothing to do with the fact that we're in a developing country. In fact, we should be even more diligent than those who may be perhaps more privileged than we are. When you are diligent, it gets you noticed. And when you are noticed for your diligence, people want to participate with you. People want to put money into your research. People want to support whatever efforts you're doing. People want to introduce you to other people who may have the funding that you need. But it all starts with diligence, just pushing diligence. You have to be so diligent up to a point whereby whenever they talk about the field with regards to diligence, they mention your name. That's the first thing I believe, in my opinion, which is important for us on the African continent. The question may come now, then how do you cultivate this diligence? I'm not a very structured person. Right now, I'm making this lecture from my laboratory / office, and I can tell you, if you are to walk in here, this place is upside down. But if you are to cultivate diligence, then it may be necessary even in a disorganized mind, to put some form of structure. Perhaps keeping a diary and a daily record of tasks that we ought to do. If it's a laboratory book, we make sure that that lab book is filled in every day. All the details are filled in until it becomes a part of us. We must be able to take stock at the end of the day of what time we spent doing what. How much time did we spend doing the right things? And we can aim to improve ourselves daily and daily and daily, and to eliminate useless activities, as well as other things which you can perhaps think about. So in our local language, there's a statement which says, "Kuudza mwana kupedzisira," which means that when you are talking to a young child, you need to give them all the details, or else they'll just catch one thing and run with it. And in this, perhaps to put this into context, many of us might then think that, okay, diligence, everything out of our lives. But there's a balance to it. There's a but. There's a negative to it, or maybe a positive in this manner. That all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. And the truth is, burnout is real. So in all our diligence, we need to be able to create time to de-stress. And this is particularly important in Africa. Well, at least in Zimbabwe, it's extremely important, given our extremely high inflation and other things like that. You have to find means and ways to de-stress. Taking care of our own mental health, finding time to exercise, to take a walk, to eat well, to meet friends, to socialize, to just have fun. That's what balances then the diligence. And when you do this from an attitude of a person who is diligent, it is all worth your while. So that's the first point, which I think is important with regards to surviving or making it research-wise in Africa. The second thing is focus and consistency. Focus and consistency. And this is particularly difficult in an environment like ours, where there might not be sufficient funding to support that very one particular area that you are interested in. But we should learn to focus on specific areas of interest and diligently work at them. In Africa, it becomes more of a problem because most of the funding would come from funders who are interested in supporting whatsoever their interests are. So the tendency is that bright minds, bright neuroscientists are then attracted with money, perhaps in the field of, I don't know, I guess schistosomiasis, but I saw someone relating schistosomiasis to neuroscience, which was pretty cool. Something totally unrelated to neuroscience. And then they tend to then abandon that. But you see, real masters are known for doing something which is specific and which they've been following over time. And it is only masters who get noticed. So in as difficult as it might be to stick to one area and focus on it consistently and consistently and consistently, if you are to make it in your area of neuroscience that you have chosen, then it might be necessary to focus and be consistent in that area. And masters always get noticed. And once you get noticed, it opens doors for support because people know that this person is dependent. He or she has been doing this work for a certain period of time. They know what they are doing. They are stable. They're not just going to change their mind, on the next day. However, I have balance to this. That in the African context, I'm not sure how it would apply in developed countries, not having done any work there. But if you do not have sufficient funding to support you in your area of focus, it would be necessary or maybe necessary to take what I've termed piece jobs. And this might involve getting involved in some research which may not necessarily be mainstream what you are interested in. Avoid the temptation to say no to anything which is not mainstream what you are interested in research-wise. Because if you do, you might probably lose out on some opportunities, on some windows. The thing is, once you are doing your piece jobs, don't get lost in the peripheries, but plan well. Don't get lost in the piece jobs. Remember what your main interest is, what your main focus is. But if the piece jobs can bring money which can sustain you, by all means, go for it, because that's the way that you'll be able to survive in Africa. It might slow down your progress, yes, but you'll still be able to survive. You won't starve, and your wife will not leave you. I think by now my wife would have left me, let it not be for the piece jobs. Okay, moving passion and enthusiasm. And I took again another dictionary definition of the word passion. The word passion means a strong, barely controllable emotion, strong enthusiasm. And I tried searching for other pictures, but this picture of this young lady just brought it up. And this is what really makes you survive during the dark times, when there is no funding, when your papers get rejected. It's that fire which is inside you. Without passion, the environment of Africa will swallow you up. At least in Zimbabwe, definitely it will swallow you up. Swallow up any aspiring young scientist. But passion needs to be cultivated, and it can be cultivated. I am sure right now during the meeting, as you are meeting, colleagues from other parts of the world, there's a certain igniting which is happening within your soul or within your spirit, a certain cultivation, a certain spark that comes out. And that's how we cultivate passion. When we meet and chat with other people of like passion, something happens to us. Even when you are down and you're about to give up, you meet somebody, he's telling you about their work, she's telling you about her work, you just brought up and you really want to push forward. And also we read about other people and what they're doing, reading journal articles. These days we have all these social media platforms which also tell us what other people are doing in our areas of interest. These also tend to, fan our passions, to ignite our passions. Joining scientific societies and associations is also extremely important, because during those dark times, there's always somebody within your circles who's got one or two things that they will be able to say to you, which will bring you up and push you forward. Balance this whole thing up. Be careful not to be blinded by passion. Should have put that blinded in quotes. And this is something which I have observed over the years, how young, passionate scientists come into the area, into the discipline, but fizzle out because they got blinded with passion. You must know that passion does not pay bills, although it can put you in an area where you can get money to pay the bills. So even with all that we are doing, we need to be passionate, yes, but we also need to be realistic as well as practical in the things that we want to do. This will save us. And also one thing which I've noted as well, when people note that you're extremely passionate, there's also a tendency for people to then abuse you. Refuse to be abused. Being passionate about something is not a ticket for people to abuse you. What do I mean by abuse? Abuse is, it happens a lot here in my country. You are taken to give, perhaps maybe it's a talk or to do some consultancy work or whatever, and not paid in accordance to the amount of knowledge that you have. Yet resources are important for you to survive in this environment of Zimbabwe or of Africa. Then moving right on, humility and teachability. And this is one thing which has helped me over the years. Young scientists, especially young PhDs, I was once there, can get a bit big-headed. And I've been working in a university environment for 2 decades now. I've watched people come and go. Yet humility. Remember when we started, one of the first slides that I put out, I said that the leadership tends to be more elder-like or totalitarian. And the way that you deal with such people is not to be confrontational, but to probably understand them, accommodate them, and then manage them in order for you to progress with whatever you are wanting to progress with. And this includes even, administrative structures at universities or whatever research organization that you may be coming with. But also, humility in itself is a good thing, because what you're sending out is that you don't know everything. You are not omniscient. You are not God. So you are saying, I am still willing to learn. I am still willing to learn. And having a good mentor helps a lot. Someone who can hold you back when you are being big-headed and say, Dexter, we don't do things like that. Calm down. In my Shona language, you'd say, Isabora pasi, which means put the ball on the ground. Calm down. There's a story that I was once told as a young man, when I was in one of the university karate team by a dearly departed instructor. He told of how a certain karate practitioner from the West went to Japan to go and study more techniques and become much better than he was. This guy had been a champion in his country, in his region, and they knew him. But he was just so big-headed. So we're told that one day the master took his young student, after having tried to teach him many times, and every time he tries to show him something, the young man is like, oh yes, I know, and it's like this. So he took him for tea. And they went to a Japanese restaurant. No, actually, in fact, he took him to his house. And the wife brought the tea in a teapot and two cups. So the master takes one of the teacups and fills it with stones and sand and gives it to the young man. Then he takes the empty teacup and pours the tea for himself. As he's about to pour the tea into the young man's cup, which was full of stones, the young man is like, but master, you can't pour tea into that cup. And the master says, remove hand, I pour tea. And he says, master, you can't pour tea into the cup. And master says, why? And he says, cup, because the cup is full of stones and sand. First, we have to empty it, wash it, then you can pour tea into it. Then the master looked at him pensively, nodded his head, and then said, you two need to eliminate stones, throw away sand, wash self, then I can teach you new techniques. And that's what humility does. That's what teachability does. It attracts people to want to show you new things. Humility unlocks knowledge. It unlocks assistance from other people, as well as many other things that can help you to survive in the environment of Africa, especially with the type of leadership that we have. They are very happy when they see a young man, a young woman who's willing to listen, who's willing to show that, okay, I've still got a lot to learn from you. And they resist you a lot when you try to show that you know more than you ought to show. But having said that, the other side of the story is that you must also be able to speak up when you know something and not just be taken aback or led to cower into a corner. Fifth thing, which over the years has got Africa to be painted with a bad paintbrush, is the issue of accountability and transparency. If people do not trust you or the way that you do things, they will be very hesitant to support your efforts. And this even starts, from your own institution, but goes out even to funding organizations. Funding organizations need to be certain that the person they are dealing with is accountable. And accountability starts with the small things. How do you spend your time in the laboratory? When the head of the lab asks you what you did, can you actually account? Is it written down? When you're asked to do something, do you actually do it? Are you transparent about it? We should learn to do honest science and to be honest ourselves. We should not be people who are thought of as producing results which are forged. That's in the domain of ethics. We should be ethical people. And it is the young generation which will change the way that the world views Africa. For too long, we are seen as people who are unaccountable or not transparent because of those who were before us, perhaps, because of our leaders, perhaps politically and elsewhere. But we need to change that. And that change starts with us. The moment that you show that you are someone who can account for the resources that you get, for the time that you are given, then you will find that you attract even more money, even more funding, even more research support coming your way. If we are to progress research-wise, we have to learn to be accountable. We have to learn to be transparent about the grants that we have, about how we use them, about the work that we do, as well as other aspects. I recall the first grant which I got was from the International Foundation of Science, just after I'd finished my PhD. It was only $12,000, but gosh, by then I thought it was a lot of money. But I had to learn to account for each and every cent to say, how did you use the money? And later on, over time, more funding starts coming from other people because they can see there's a track record. You got some money, you did the work, and you finished it. And the funders can pledge and say, yes, indeed, we finished it. And you can put that in your applications and say, previous applications that I had an application, successful application with the International Foundation for Science. I did A, B, C, D, E, F, G. This is what came out research-wise, but I was also able to account for it. This is extremely important from an African setting. The moment you mess up on issues to do with accountability and transparency, then it's like shutting the door on yourself, especially in Africa. Because like I said right at the beginning, we are starting off the back foot and we need to work harder than everybody else does. Sixth thing is relevance. We must seek to do work which is relevant. Not just work which is exciting to us, but work which is relevant. You see, money chases relevant research. What the world is looking for are solutions to their problems. And if the research that we are doing is bringing a solution, especially within the African context, then money tends to follow. And as I shall maybe talk about it later, when you speak to these politicians and other people in authority, and they can see the relevance of the work that you are doing, I have found that somehow your research then becomes a priority and somehow money is actually released or funding is released to come your way. Real research must seek answers to questions that are of relevance in our own setting. But unfortunately, the temptation is to go where the money is. And it's a fair enough temptation because of the world that we live. I mean, funders have got specific things that they want to fund. But if we can prove and show the relevance of the work that we are doing, surely I think we can be able to get some money. I don't know what your thoughts are about this. Maybe perhaps there should be a balance to it. Like I have here, that sometimes you might just have to see the interface of where your research interfaces with research of other people. I enjoyed listening to the presentations on Sunday, and somebody was talking about schistosomiasis, and they found an interface of where it interfaces with neuroscience. And it's the same thing. If all the funding appears to be in HIV/AIDS, we find an interface of where our interest in neuroscience interface with HIV/AIDS. If all the funding is in toxicology, snakebite, we find where neuroscience, interfaces with snakebite. And this is the portion that we want to operate in, that portion of relevance. The seventh one, which perhaps to me is one of the most, if not the most important of all the things which I have talked about so far. And this one is the issue of communication, collaboration, and networking. We must, first of all, learn how to communicate. And communication, of course, we must know how to communicate our ideas, the work that we're doing, in an exciting manner. We must be able to give elevator pitches that in 1 minute, I can get someone excited about the work which I am doing. In 2 minutes, I can get someone excited about the work that I am doing. In 3 minutes, in 5 minutes, in 30 seconds, we must train ourselves to communicate our ideas and our results and other things in a manner that is clear and convincing. And this is a must. And the only way that we learn to do this is by doing it and getting someone else perhaps to help us to improve on it. But you cannot start without starting. We have to learn to communicate. We must learn and be willing to publish our work. I heard Martha on Sunday also talking about the importance of publishing our work. Not just publishing our work, but also to sell our ideas to others. To always find spaces where if there is a meeting which is talking about the budget or whatever else, when we raise up our hands, we are talking about a neuroscience related issue, which is relevant to the society that we are in. In that way, we are noticed. And in that way, funds can actually be released to come our way. In Africa, if you cannot talk in quotes nicely to other people, your research will perish. And I'll explain this. This is perhaps one of the things which I learned. You see, I visited labs elsewhere in the world where everything you need is housed within the same environment. You need an HPLC machine, it's there for you. You need a plus maze, which is linked to any maze or whatever else, it is there right for you. But in the setting that we are in Africa, all the resources would be in different places. When I started the work which I've been working on, which I've been doing on neuropharmacological effects of African traditional medicines, I would go out with my students to collect the plants. We would dry the plants at the Department of Pharmacy. After they were dried, we would take the plants, the dried plants, for milling at the Faculty of Agriculture. That took speaking nicely to someone and saying, "Oh, please, can I use your grinding machine to be able to do this?" After grinding them, we would come back to the Department of Pharmacy and do whether it's our extraction using ethanol or whatever else. We did not have a rotary viper by then, so we then take whatever solvent extract we have to the chemistry department to go and get our rotary evaporation done. And because when you use solvents like 70% ethanol, there's always the water component, which is very difficult to remove using rotary vapor. That means you need to freeze dry it. We had no freeze dry in the Department of Pharmacy. Then I would take the extracts, go across to veterinary science, we had a freeze dryer, and we'd use it there. And after doing that, take our extracts, go to the animal house, that's another department. So this talks about networking and talking to different people, and that's extremely, extremely, extremely important in our setting in Africa. Because without this, I tell you, you cannot progress. And there's another tip, maybe a side tip. When you're doing your ordering of chemicals, it's a good idea also to have it in mind that there might be some other people who require the chemicals that you will be using, who may have chemicals that you may also want to use. That's also part of communicating and networking, collaborating and talking nicely to other people. So in science or in academia, they used to say publish or perish, but I say collaborate or perish, network or perish, communicate or perish. And thought that I just want to put across to you. And the first 7, I presented them 10 years ago during that time. And I've seen them to be true. But I've also discovered an 8th one, which is the final one, which I just added in today when I was making this talk. And I've called it Think Alternatives and Back to Basics. In other words, think outside the box. In other words, don't be tied down by the methods which you have come across in literature. Let me try to explain this. So you'll find that in our setting in Africa, you'll not always have the equipment that you require. Neither will you have the resources that you require, let alone the expertise that you require. And the temptation is to give up, get stuck, and say, oh, these things don't work in Africa. But what I am saying with this is that there are some questions that you have to ask yourself. And I intentionally allow my students to go and find methods for themselves, for whatever neuropharmacological test they may want to do. And they get all these high-end methods. But when they come back and they say, but say we don't have this equipment, the question I always ask is this the only method there is? What are the other alternative methods? What are the cons and pros of the alternative methods? Will I still achieve, or will you still achieve your intended goals? And it's so important to do this. Because you see, neuroscience has improved over the years. But the foundations, and this is where the back to basics comes into place, the foundations are still the same. The equipment may be a bit more sophisticated, but the foundational issues, the crux of the study of neuroscience, at least coming from a behavioral pharmacology, it's still the same. If it's a plasmase, you're still looking at the same parameters. You might have a camera now, perhaps you might have some, ultraviolet, some what you call them, infrared beams to automatically record the movement of the mice. But ultimately, the science is still the same. So ask yourself also, how did the early researchers do it? How did they answer my research question? And go back to the basics. And you always find that there's always a way. Yes, it might have some issues which can be discussed in the discussion of your paper, which you will need to account for perhaps, which may be necessary, to deal with in years to come. But it doesn't mean we should stop. We don't stop in Africa. We think alternatives. We think back to basics. We think outside the box. We have to continue doing the work. And as the results start coming in, you start to attract other people's attention. And before you know it, the equipment that you've always wanted, the methods that you've always wanted in your lab, you can then start to establish them. So you don't really want to get stuck to start with. But even when you're doing alternatives and going back to basics, we don't want to stay there. We want to move on. But you can only move on once you've started producing results which are reproducible, which other people can look at and say, yes, indeed, there was some good science there. Just go through those again. So I talked about the importance of diligence, importance of focus and consistency, importance of passion and enthusiasm. And a meeting like the one we're having in Ghana, that's a beautiful place to continue fanning the passion. With the issue of humility and teachability, transparency and accountability, relevance of the work we're doing, collaboration, communication, and networking. And finally, thinking outside the box or thinking alternatives and back to basics. These are things that have helped me in my research career in Africa. And I've done all my work within this African context. And if these things can be cultivated in us, I'm sure we can be able to go to the next place in terms of where we're supposed to go in neuropharmacology. Thank you so much for listening to me. I hope that this stirred up at least something within you, a spark to be able to start thinking, maybe some ray of light, some hope. But we can make it in Africa. We don't give up. We find solutions. We think outside the box. We think alternatives. We think back to basics. Until we meet again for our other lecture. Thank you so much and God bless you. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much.